My name is Nola Becker. I'm 27 years old. I never imagined that right in front of the judge, my father would slap my mother. The slap echoed through the courtroom with such a sharp crack that even the flag seemed to flinch. My father's voice followed, cold and triumphant. "You've been worthless your whole life. You should just die." For a moment, the entire room went silent. I rose to my feet, the fabric of my service uniform pulling taut across my shoulders. I took off my green beret and placed it on the witness table like a silent gavel. "Your Honor," I said, "please refer to the last page." My father turned, and the blood drained from his face. Before I continue my story, let me know where you're listening from. And please hit like and subscribe so you don't miss these stories of justice being served. The air in the Allegheny County courtroom was thick and smelled of old wood, floor polish, and stale desperation. It was a stagnant air, recycled for decades, carrying the ghosts of 1,000 other broken families. I sat in the second row, my back straight, my hands resting on my knees. My mother, Eleanor, sat at the plaintiff's table, looking impossibly small. Her shoulders were curved inward, her hands trembling so hard she had to clasp them in her lap to still them. She looked like a sparrow in a hawk's nest. The hawk, my father, Arthur Becker, stood beside his lawyer. He wasn't a large man, but he radiated an oppressive energy that filled the space around him. His chest was puffed out, his cheap suit pulled tight, a smirk playing on his lips. He was enjoying this. Every second of my mother's humiliation was a shot of whiskey to his soul. "Mrs. Becker," the judge said, his voice a tired drone. "You just need to sign." My mother flinched at the sound of her name. Her lawyer, a young, overwhelmed public defender, gently pushed the divorce settlement papers and a cheap ballpoint pen toward her. The document was an execution order for her life. It signed away the house she'd turned into a home, the savings she'd scrimped for, and any claim to my father's pension. It was a declaration of her complete and total defeat. She reached for the pen, her fingers hesitating just above the plastic. I saw my father lean in. His lawyer put a cautionary hand on his arm, but Arthur shook it off. He lowered his head, his voice a venomous whisper that carried in the dead quiet of the room. "You disgust me," he hissed. Then he moved. It wasn't a wild swing, it was a precise, practiced motion. His hand shot out and connected with my mother's cheek. The sound was a sharp, ugly crack. It wasn't just a slap, it was an explosion of sound that shattered the courtroom's solemnity. The clerk's typing stopped. A woman in the jury box gasped. The bailiff, a burly man with a thick mustache, shifted his weight, his hand instinctively moving closer to his side. My mother's head snapped to the side, a bright red mark blooming on her pale skin. She didn't cry out. She just froze, her eyes wide with a familiar, soul-deep terror. Then came the curse, delivered not in a shout, but in a cold, matter-of-fact tone, as if stating the weather. "You should just die." It was the culmination of 30 years of emotional battery, the final nail in a coffin he'd been building for her since their wedding day. My training took over. In a crisis, you don't react. You assess. Breathe in, hold, breathe out. The room was the target area. My father was the hostile. My mother was the asset to be protected. The judge was the undecided variable. I stood up. My movement was fluid and silent. There was no scrape of a chair, no hurried motion. But in that suffocating silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. Every head in the room turned toward me. They didn't see Nola Becker, the daughter. They saw the uniform. The Army Green Service uniform, with its rows of ribbons. A language of hardship and service they didn't speak but instinctively understood. They saw the rank of sergeant on my sleeve. This was the costume, as my father used to call it. Today, it was my armor. My stillness was a weapon he'd never encountered. In our house, his rage was met with my mother's tears or my brother's avoidance. It was never met with a calm, unblinking gaze. He looked at me, his sneer faltering for the first time. He saw something in my eyes he couldn't bully, something he couldn't break. He saw a stranger. I walked the few steps to the witness table that separated the gallery from the court. My footsteps were even and measured on the worn linoleum. I reached up and with a deliberate motion, removed my green beret. The soft, dark green felt was familiar in my hands. It wasn't just a hat. It was a physical manifestation of an unbreakable will, proof of thousands of hours of hell that had burned away every last ounce of the scared little girl my father had tried to create. It was a symbol of a world he could never touch, a world where respect is earned through sweat and pain, not demanded through fear. I placed the beret on the polished wood of the table. It made a soft, definitive thud. The quiet sound landed with the force of a gavel. It was the sound of a new war being declared, on my terms, on my battlefield. I looked directly at the judge, whose tired expression had been replaced by one of sharp focus. Your Honor, my voice was level, clear, and devoid of emotion. Please refer to the last page. The silence stretched. My father, who had been momentarily stunned, whipped his head around to stare at me, his face a mask of confusion and rage. What is this? What are you doing? He sputtered. His lawyer was already flipping through his copy of the settlement papers, his brow furrowed. He got to the last page, and I saw his eyes widen. Arthur followed his gaze. He saw it. His face went through a rapid, sickening transformation. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by disbelief. The disbelief melted into dawning comprehension, and the comprehension curdled into a raw, primal fear. It was the look of a tyrant who has just realized, far too late, that the slave he'd been whipping for years had spent every night secretly forging a sword. In that moment, he didn't see his daughter. He saw a soldier. He saw a strategist who had outmaneuvered him. For the very first time in my 27 years of life, I saw fear in my father's eyes. The judge adjusted his glasses, peering down at the document. He looked from the page to me, then to my father. He cleared his throat. Bailiff, he said, his voice now carrying a new weight. Please retrieve the documents Miss Becker is providing. The bailiff stepped forward, his eyes never leaving my father. As he took the file from my hands, I watched the terror solidify on Arthur's face. He always believed only a son could bring him glory, but he never imagined it would be his daughter who would bring him to justice. He always believed only a son could bring him glory. And his son, Mark, never had to do a single thing to earn it. The scales of justice in the Becker household had been broken long before we ever set foot in that courtroom. There were two sets of rules, two standards of worth, two separate worlds under one roof. There was Mark's world, and then there was mine. The lesson started early. I remember Christmas morning when I was 10 and Mark was 12. The living room smelled of pine needles and my mom's cinnamon rolls. Under the tree, leaning against the wall, was a brand new Mongoose BMX bike, its chrome frame gleaming under the twinkle lights. It was for Mark. He let out a whoop and immediately started trying to do wheelies on the carpet, leaving black scuff marks my mother would later scrub out on her hands and knees. My present was a large pink box. Inside was a plastic toy kitchen, complete with a tiny oven and plastic pots and pans. I remember the hollow feeling in my chest, a quiet sort of ache. I looked from the bike to my box. Why don't I get a bike? I asked, my voice small. My father, Arthur, looked up from his cup of coffee, a smug grin on his face. He chuckled. Bikes are for boys, Nola. Girls just need to know the way from the house to the grocery store. That summer, I became a small-town entrepreneur. I mowed lawns for $5 a pop, pulled weeds for Mrs. Henderson next door, and washed cars with a rusty bucket and old rags. I saved every crumpled dollar bill in a shoebox under my bed. By August, I had enough. I bought a second-hand Schwinn from a garage sale. It was heavy, a bit rusty on the fenders, but it was mine. I was so proud I practically floated it home. When I wheeled it into the driveway, my father was out front, polishing his Ford pickup. He glanced at my bike, then back at his truck, and snorted. Looks like a pile of scrap. He never saw the work. He only saw the imperfection. That became the pattern of my childhood. I learned that my effort was invisible, but my gender was a permanent, glaring flaw. In high school, I pushed myself. I joined the track team, the debate club, anything to build a resume of accomplishments he couldn't ignore. One evening, I brought home my report card. Straight A's. I'd even gotten an A in advanced placement physics. I handed it to him, my heart doing a nervous little flutter. I wasn't expecting a parade, but maybe just a nod. A simple, good job. He took the paper, glanced at it for less than a second, and tossed it on the kitchen counter next to a stack of mail. Good, he said without looking at me. Now go do the dishes. Your mother's tired. The bitter taste of injustice was sharp in my throat. Later that same night, Mark came home, slamming the door. He was 17, and he drove his car like he was invincible. He threw a piece of paper on the table. It was a speeding ticket. He'd been caught doing 60 in a 35 zone. My father picked it up. He read it, and a long, weary sigh escaped his lips. But then he looked at Mark, and a strange sort of pride softened his features. He clapped him on the shoulder. "Boys will be boys," he said almost fondly. "Just be more careful next time, son." He paid the fine the next day without another word. My straight A's were a chore to be acknowledged before I returned to my duties. Mark's recklessness was a rite of passage. I remember reading Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, for a class project. All my friends were so inspired by it, talking about claiming their seat at the table. I just felt a quiet rage. The book didn't have a chapter on what to do when the table is in your own dining room, and your father is the one who flips it over every time you try to sit down. After each of these little cuts, my mother would find me. She'd slip into my room at night, a plate with a couple of Chips Ahoy, cookies in her hand, her presence a soft apology. "Don't you mind him, honey," she'd whisper, sitting on the edge of my bed. "Your father's just old-fashioned. He loves you, in his own way." But I'd look into her tired eyes and see the truth. It wasn't love, it was control. And her excuses, meant to soothe me, only made the loneliness worse. They confirmed I was on my own in this fight. She had chosen her side, the side of survival, and it wasn't my side. The breaking point came on a humid night in July, the summer before my senior year. The garage was my sanctuary, the only place I felt strong. It smelled of gasoline, motor oil, and damp concrete. I'd installed a pull-up bar between two of the rafters. I was trying to beat my personal record, my muscles screaming, my body covered in a sheen of sweat. The garage door flew open, and there he was, silhouetted by the porch light. His face was twisted in disgust. "What in God's name are you doing?" he roared. "You look like a gorilla, a freak of nature. Go put on a dress or something, for crying out loud." I dropped from the bar, my hands raw, my heart pounding with shame and fury. I didn't say a word. I just walked past him, back into the house, and locked myself in my room. That night, I didn't cry. The time for tears was over. I opened my laptop, the screen a bright rectangle in the darkness. I typed a simple phrase into the search bar. "Hardest jobs for women." The screen filled with articles. I read about the first women to graduate from the Army's Ranger School. I read about Special Forces, the Green Berets. I read about a world built on a single, brutal principle: merit. A world where your performance is all that matters. Where you are judged not by who you are, but by what you can do. A place where weakness is purged, regardless of gender. It was no longer about running away from my father. It was about running towards something. It was a decision made in the quiet hum of a computer, a silent vow to the girl hanging from the rafters. I would forge my body and my will into something he could never, ever call weak again. I would become a weapon he couldn't recognize, let alone control. The decision itself was easy, forged in the quiet fury of my bedroom. Telling my mother was another matter entirely. It felt like a betrayal, like I was saving myself by leaving her behind in the war zone. I waited until midnight. The only sounds in the house were the hum of the refrigerator and the faint, rumbling snores of my father, passed out in his armchair in front of the TV. The air was thick with the stale smell of Budweiser. I found my mom in the kitchen, bathed in the soft, yellow light above the sink. She was wiping down the counters with a worn sponge, her back stooped in a way that had become her permanent posture. She moved with a silent, weary grace, erasing the evidence of the day. My footsteps were quiet on the linoleum, but she sensed me. She turned, a faint, tired smile on her face that didn't quite reach her eyes. Can't sleep, honey? I took a deep breath. Mom, I started, my voice barely a whisper. I'm enlisting. In the army. The sponge slipped from her hand and fell into the sink with a soft splash. Her smile vanished. Her eyes, the same blue as mine, widened with a sudden, sharp terror. No, she breathed, shaking her head as she took a step back. Oh, Nola, no. The world out there, it'll eat you alive. I understood her fear. It wasn't about foreign battlefields or the dangers of combat. She saw the world as a bigger, more brutal version of our own house. Her fear was that I was leaving one cage only to enter another, filled with men just like my father. Men who believed strength was a birthright of their gender, and that a woman's place was to be silent and small. A wave of guilt washed over me, cold and heavy. But my resolve held firm. I couldn't let her fear become my future. It's not like that, Mom, I said gently, stepping closer. I didn't talk about running away from him. I framed it as running towards something better. I told her about building a life where my worth wasn't up for debate, where my accomplishments would be measured and valued. I told her about the articles I'd read, my voice growing stronger with conviction. I told her about Captain Kristen Griest and First Lieutenant Shay Haver, the two women who, just a couple of years prior, had graduated from Ranger School. It's possible, Mom, I insisted. They proved it. They showed that the standards are the standards, and if you can meet them, it doesn't matter who you are. I watched the conflict in her eyes. The fear was still there, a deep, primal instinct to protect her child. But something else was dawning, a flicker of understanding. She saw this wasn't a teenager's impulsive decision. This was a survival plan. She looked at me, really looked at me, and saw not the little girl she wanted to shield, but the young woman I'd been forced to become. Her shoulders slumped and the fight went out of her. She pulled me into a hug, her thin arms wrapping tightly around me. I could feel her body trembling as she started to cry, silent tears soaking into the collar of my t-shirt. I'm so scared, Nola, she sobbed quietly. But I understand. You have to go. You have to go to find yourself. It was the most painful and beautiful blessing she could have given me. It was the acceptance of a mother who loved her daughter enough to let her walk into the fire, praying she would emerge forged, not broken. A few weeks later, the night before I was due to report to the bus station, we sat on the front porch swing. The summer air was warm, filled with the chirping of crickets. My father was out with his friends. The quiet felt like a gift. My mom held my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Nola, she said, her voice serious in a way I'd rarely heard. The army is going to make you tough. They're going to teach you how to be hard, how to survive things most people can't even imagine. She turned to look at me, her eyes gleaming in the dim porch light. But you have to promise me something. When you get that power, when you become strong, promise me you'll never use it to make someone else feel small. Promise me you won't become the kind of person who made you have to get strong in the first place. Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow. In all my planning, in all my focus on physical strength and mental fortitude, I had never considered the risk to my own soul. Her request became a vow. It settled deep inside me, a moral compass I would carry into every challenge. I promise, Mom, I said, my voice thick with emotion. The next morning was gray and overcast, matching the mood. My mother and my younger sister, Maya, came to see me off at the downtown bus station. Mark was nowhere to be seen, probably still asleep. My father didn't even bother to come out of the house. As I walked down the driveway, I heard his voice, muffled by the screen door. Good riddance. Let's see how long you last. I didn't turn around. I refused to give him the satisfaction. I hugged Maya tightly, then my mother. She pressed a folded $20 bill into my hand. For snacks, she whispered, trying to smile through her tears. I climbed the steps of the Greyhound bus and found a seat by the window. As the bus pulled away from the curb with a hydraulic hiss, I looked out. My mother and Maya stood on the sidewalk, getting smaller and smaller. My mother wasn't waving frantically. She was just standing there, a solitary, resilient figure against the bleak backdrop of our small Pennsylvania town, watching her daughter march off to war. That image of my mother, standing strong on that lonely sidewalk, was the last piece of warmth I held onto as I walked into the furnace. It was the image I carried with me into the hell that was basic training. But hell has levels. And the hell of Special Forces Assessment and Selection, or SFAS, at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, was a circle all its own. From the moment I stepped off the bus, I was an anomaly, a curiosity. Out of the couple hundred candidates vying for a spot in the legendary Q course, I was the only woman. The air was thick with testosterone, pine sap, and the humid, heavy heat of a Carolina summer. And I could feel the weight of hundreds of pairs of eyes on me, sizing me up, judging me, waiting for me to fail. The whispers followed me everywhere. To the chow hall, to the barracks, out on the grueling ruck marches. They called me Barbie. The diversity hire. The token. They didn't say it to my face, of course. They'd say it just loud enough for me to hear as I walked past. During the long marches, with 60-pound rucks digging into our shoulders, I'd see some of them slow down, letting me pass just so they could watch me, waiting for the moment my legs would buckle. But they never did. Every time my lungs burned and my thighs screamed, I didn't see the long, dusty road ahead of me. I saw my mother on her hands and knees, scrubbing Mark's tire tracks off her good carpet. I saw her picking up the pieces of a plate my father had thrown against the wall. Each memory was a log on the fire in my gut. Each step was a silent act of defiance. Pain was temporary. My father's world was the one I refused to go back to. About a week in, one of the instructors pulled me aside. Master Sergeant Davis. He was a mountain of a man, carved from granite, with a calm, steady gaze that seemed to see right through you. He didn't offer sympathy. He didn't tell me to keep my chin up. He just looked at me and said in his deep, gravelly voice, "Becker, listen up. Nobody here gives a damn if you're male or female. You know what they care about? They care if you're a liability. They care if you're going to get them killed because you can't pull your weight." He leaned in a little closer. "So stop listening to the chatter. Stop trying to prove anything with your mouth. Just do the work. Shut up and do the work. Be the teammate they would trust with their life. The rest," he said, straightening up, "will sort itself out." His words were like a splash of cold water. He wasn't my protector. He was my instructor. And he had just given me the only key I needed to survive. From that day on, I became a ghost. I spoke only when necessary. I focused on the task in front of me, my map, my compass, my rifle, the teammate to my left, and the one to my right. I just did the work. The ultimate test came months later, during the final phase of the Q course. It was an infamous land navigation event called the Star Course, a brutal multi-day endurance test through the dense, unforgiving wilderness of the Uwharrie National Forest. Our small team had been moving for nearly 36 hours, surviving on minimal sleep and protein bars that tasted like cardboard. A cold, relentless rain had started, turning the red Carolina clay into a slick, ankle-deep mud. That's when Corporal Jensen went down. He was one of the loudest of the whisperers, a guy who had made it clear he thought I was a waste of a slot. He slipped on a wet rock, and we all heard the sickening pop of his ankle. He tried to stand, but his face went pale with pain. He was done. "Just leave me," he grunted, slumping against a tree. "I'll call it in. You guys go on, or you'll miss the deadline." For a moment, nobody moved. We were all exhausted, mentally and physically shattered. Leaving him was the logical choice. But then I saw his shoulders slump in defeat, and I didn't see Corporal Jensen, the arrogant jerk. I saw a man at his breaking point. I remembered my mother's promise: don't use your strength to make others feel small. I unslung my ruck. "Nobody's leaving anyone," I said, my voice flat and authoritative. The others looked at me, surprised. I pulled out my medical kit and began stabilizing his ankle, my hands moving with practiced efficiency. We started as a team. We finish as a team. I got him to his feet, slung his arm over my shoulder, and took most of his weight. For the next 8 miles through the darkness and the driving rain, we moved. I navigated, using the terrain and my compass, while the others helped clear the way. It was the single hardest thing I have ever done. But we made it. We stumbled into the final checkpoint with just minutes to spare, covered in mud, shivering, and utterly spent. I never said a word to Jensen about his earlier comments. I just did the work. The graduation ceremony was held in a large formal auditorium at Fort Bragg. We stood in perfect formation, our dress uniforms immaculate. When my name was called, Sergeant Nola Becker. A hush fell over the room. I walked onto the stage, my steps echoing in the silence. As the commandant pinned the coveted long tab on my shoulder and a decorated veteran placed the green beret on my head, the room remained quiet. I turned to face the crowd, my posture perfect, my expression neutral. Then, from the middle of the auditorium, one person stood up and began to clap. It was Jensen, his ankle in a boot, but standing tall. Then another soldier stood, and another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet, the room thundering with an explosion of applause. It wasn't pity. It wasn't a token gesture. It was respect, hard-earned and absolute. As I stood there, the weight of the beret on my head felt real, solid. I didn't think about my father. I didn't think about his scorn or his disbelief. I thought about my mother and the promise I made to her on that dark porch. I'd become strong. Now it was time to learn how to use that strength the right way. But as I walked off that stage, a question echoed in the back of my mind. Was I ready for the real war? The answer arrived a few months later, the moment I opened my front door. I'd come home on leave, unannounced. I wanted to surprise my mom, see a genuine smile light up her face, but I was the one who got the shock. The door was unlocked, which was unusual, and a wave of strange, cloyingly sweet perfume hit me like a physical blow. It was cheap, trying too hard, a desperate scent that didn't belong. I knew instantly. This wasn't my home anymore. The feeling of wrongness grew as I stepped inside. Over the fireplace, where my parents' wedding photo had hung for 30 years, there was now a new picture. My father, grinning, with his arm around a blonde woman in a tight red dress. On my mother's favorite armchair, a worn-out recliner she loved, sat the source of the perfume. A woman I'd never seen before was lounging there, her feet propped up on the coffee table, painting her toenails a garish shade of pink. She looked up, and a slow, lazy smirk spread across her face as she took in my uniform. And then my blood ran cold. She was wearing the pale blue cashmere sweater I had saved up to buy for my mom last Christmas. It was an act of dominance, a trophy worn by a conqueror. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," she drawled, waving her nail polish brush in the air. "The warrior princess returns. Your father is upstairs with your mother. I think they're discussing the future." I didn't give her the satisfaction of a response. My training kicked in again. Assess, don't react. I analyzed her like a hostile operative, late 30s, bleached hair, hard eyes, an opportunist, a predator. I filed the information away and headed for the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to break out. The scene in my parents' bedroom was worse than anything I could have imagined. My mother was huddled on the edge of the bed, a small broken thing, her face streaked with tears. My father, Arthur, stood over her, his hands on his hips, his posture radiating pure menace. A sheaf of papers lay scattered on the bedspread around her. "Sign it, Eleanor," he snarled, his voice a low growl. "You think you're walking away with a single dime? This house, the cars, the pension, it's all mine. You're leaving with what you came with. Nothing." And then I saw my brother. Mark, the golden boy, was there. He was leaning against the far wall, staring out the window at the neighbor's perfectly manicured lawn, pretending he was anywhere else. My mother looked at him, her eyes pleading for help, for just one of her children to stand up for her. Mark wouldn't meet her gaze. He just mumbled at the window pane. "Just sign it, Mom. Let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be." His cowardice was a second slap, one that cut even deeper than my father's. It was the ultimate betrayal. He wasn't just silent, he was an accomplice. Just as I was about to step into the room, the blonde Cassandra sauntered up the stairs and draped herself over my father's arm, marking her territory. She looked me up and down, a look of pure, condescending challenge in her eyes. "Listen here, little soldier," she said, her voice dripping with poison-laced honey. "Your mother's time is up. It's my time now. The best thing you can do is convince the old thing to sign. Otherwise, she'll be out on the street with nothing but the pathetic look on her face." She giggled, then turned and purred at my father. "Honey, I was thinking we should paint this room a nice peach color. It would really brighten the place up." I didn't explode. I didn't yell. The rage inside me cooled, hardening into something dense and cold, like a block of ice. In that moment, I stopped seeing a family dispute. My overseas training had taught me to recognize the tactics of an insurgency. My father wasn't a bad husband anymore. He was a hostile force occupying territory. Cassandra was his collaborator, and my mother was a civilian hostage. I walked into the room. My presence shifted the dynamic instantly. I didn't look at my father or Cassandra. My focus was solely on the asset. I walked to the bed, calmly knelt in front of my mother, and took her trembling hands in mine. "Mom," I said, my voice steady. "Look at me." She finally lifted her head, her eyes swimming with despair. "We're leaving," I said. It wasn't a question. It was an order. I helped her to her feet, and without a single glance back at the stunned faces of the enemy, I guided her out of the room, down the stairs, and out the front door. We ended up at a cheap Motel 6 off the highway, the room smelling of stale cigarettes and disinfectant. My mother cried for hours, a storm of grief and humiliation that had been held back for years. I just sat in the chair opposite the bed, watching her, letting her release it all. When she finally fell into an exhausted sleep, I looked at her, and the ice in my veins began to melt, replaced by a white-hot, focused resolve. This was no longer just about getting her out. This was about justice. This was an operation. I pulled out my phone, opened the Notes app, and started a new file. The title was simple: Operation Freedom for Eleanor. As I sat there in the dim light of that motel room, listening to my mother's troubled breathing, I knew I couldn't do this alone. If you've ever felt that righteous anger, that fierce need to protect someone you love, please show your support by hitting the like button. And let me know you're with me on this mission by commenting the word justice below. Seeing your support means the world. Now, let me tell you how Phase 1 began. Operation Freedom for Eleanor had officially begun. Phase 1 of any operation is intelligence gathering. Human intelligence, HUMINT. And my primary source, my mother, was sitting across from me in that sterile motel room, exhausted but ready. The next morning, I turned our temporary refuge into a forward operating base. I went to a nearby Staples and bought a large whiteboard, markers, and a stack of legal pads. I set it up against the wall, turning the cheap landscape painting of a generic beach into the backdrop for our war room. I started with a simple timeline. I drew a long black line across the middle of the board. "Okay, Mom," I said, my voice calm and steady. "We're just going to talk. Start anywhere you want. Anything you remember." My training taught me how to debrief a source without re-traumatizing them. You don't ask, "When did he hit you?" That forces them to relive the impact. Instead, you create a framework. You ask about objective, external events. "Let's think about Thanksgiving, 2018, I said gently. Mark came home from college for that one. What happened in the kitchen after dinner? At first, she was hesitant. Her stories were a jumble of painful fragments. But as I wrote each detail on the board, connecting events with dates, a coherent picture began to form. Each memory, once a source of shame, was now being repurposed. It was no longer a wound, it was data. A story emerged about the time he threw the TV remote at her head because his football team, the Steelers, missed a field goal. It left a gash over her eyebrow that required stitches. The official story was that she'd slipped on a wet floor. I wrote it down. December 2017. Injury to forehead. Witness, none. Cover story, slipped. Another memory surfaced. The time she'd bought a new dress to wear to her cousin's wedding. He'd told her it made her look cheap, then took a pair of scissors and methodically cut it to ribbons in front of her. June 2019. Destruction of property. Psychological abuse. Witness. Maya, age 14. The story of the night he'd locked her out of the house in the middle of a Pennsylvania winter because she was 10 minutes late coming home from the grocery store. She'd had to sleep in the car. February 22nd, endangerment. Witness, neighbor, reported seeing her in the car. For 2 days, we worked. Every painful memory was carefully extracted and placed on the timeline. It was excruciating, but with each story she told, I saw a subtle shift in my mother. The shame in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a quiet resolve. She wasn't just a victim anymore, she was a witness. Next came signals intelligence, SIGINT, and open source intelligence, OSINT. With my mother's permission, I logged into their joint bank accounts. The public face of their finances looked normal. But it didn't take long to find the anomaly. My mother mentioned a credit card he'd opened in his name only for business expenses. I accessed the statements online. It was a roadmap of his betrayal. Tens of thousands of dollars spent on Cassandra, a trip to the Bahamas, a Michael Kors handbag, jewelry from Tiffany's. I downloaded every statement, highlighting each expense, cross-referencing the dates with his supposed business trips. Each transaction was another bullet for our magazine. Then I moved to OSINT. I searched public records online. I found 2 police reports from the past 5 years, filed under their address for domestic disturbance. Both times, a neighbor had called 911. Both times, my mother had refused to press charges, telling the officers she had just been clumsy. The reports were inconclusive, but they established a pattern. They were dots on a map, and I was connecting them. The final piece was imagery intelligence, EMINT. I remembered the emails my mom used to send me when I was deployed. She was never one to complain, so she'd send me pictures of her garden, of the dog, of a new recipe she tried. They were her way of saying everything was okay. But I had a gut feeling. I spent an entire night scrolling through years of emails, downloading every photo she had ever sent. At first, I saw nothing, just flowers and sunsets. Then I found one from the spring of 2019. She was showing off her new rose bushes. But in the reflection of the living room window behind her, you could just make out her face. And on her cheek, a faint, purplish bruise, poorly concealed with makeup. My blood went cold. I cross-referenced the date of the email with our timeline. It was 2 days after the incident with the dress. He hadn't just destroyed her property, he had hit her. I found more. A photo of her holding a birthday cake for Maya, wearing a long-sleeved turtleneck in the middle of July. A few days after he'd supposedly accidentally slammed a car door on her arm. Each photo was a silent scream for help that I had been too far away to hear. After a week, our motel room looked like something out of a spy movie. The whiteboard was a web of dates, events, and connecting lines. A thick binder on the table was filled with printed bank statements, police reports, and annotated photographs. I had taken the chaotic, messy pain of 30 years and organized it into a weapon. It was no longer a collection of heartbreaking memories. It was an undeniable, meticulously documented case file, a target package on Arthur Becker. My mother, who had been watching me work, now had a spark of light in her eyes I hadn't seen in years. She stood a little taller. The stoop in her shoulders was less pronounced. She'd seen the full scope of her own prison, and now she was seeing the key to unlock it. I closed the binder and looked at her, my voice clear and certain. "Mom," I said, "we're not going to need a great lawyer. We're just going to need someone who can read. Because these numbers and pictures, they don't know how to lie. Those numbers and pictures in my binder, they didn't know how to lie." But I quickly learned that to make a court of law listen to those silent truths, you still need a voice. And that voice costs money. My remaining leave was a blur of phone calls and disappointing meetings. I found a list of divorce attorneys in the Pittsburgh area and started making appointments. My mother and I sat in 2 different lavishly decorated offices on plush leather chairs that probably cost more than my first car. Both times, the story was the same. The first lawyer, a man with a gold watch and a practiced, sympathetic smile, leafed through my carefully organized binder. "This is compelling, yes," he said, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on a photograph. "But he will say she's clumsy. He will say these credit card bills were business expenses. In cases like this, it often comes down to he said, she said. It could get messy, Complicated. He then quoted us a retainer fee that was more than my mother had seen in her entire life. The second lawyer, a woman this time, was even more dismissive. She barely glanced at the evidence. "Look, I see dozens of messy divorces a week," she said, already looking at the clock on her wall. "Without a clear smoking gun, this could drag on for years." She also quoted an astronomical fee. We walked out into the cold Pennsylvania air, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind us. My mother's newfound resolve was starting to crumble. "It's no use, Nola," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The system is built for men like him. For people with money." For the first time since this had started, I felt a stab of despair. She was right. We had the truth. But the truth was locked behind a paywall we couldn't afford. The doors of justice were being slammed in our faces. That night, back in the motel, I felt completely stuck. I scrolled through my phone contacts, not knowing who to turn to. Then my eyes landed on a name, Msekiel Davis, my old instructor from SFAS. I hesitated. We weren't friends. He was my mentor, a figure of immense authority. But I remembered his words, "The rest will sort itself out." I wasn't asking for a handout, just a point in the right direction. I dialed his number. He picked up on the second ring. "Becker," he answered, his voice the same calm baritone I remembered. I explained the situation, trying to keep my voice as professional and detached as possible, laying out the facts like I was giving a mission brief. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, I thought I had made a mistake. "I know someone," he said finally. The relief that washed over me was so intense, my knees felt weak. "A lawyer, a damn good one. Her name is Sarah Jenkins. Served 10 years in the JAG Corps. Specializes in family law. She owes me a favor." He gave me her number, and I called the next morning. Her office wasn't in a high-rise downtown. It was a modest, clean space above a coffee shop. When we walked in, Sarah Jenkins stood up to greet us. She was a tall, sharp woman in her 40s with an air of no-nonsense competence. She shook my hand firmly, her eyes meeting mine with a look of mutual understanding. It was the look of a fellow veteran. We sat down, and I didn't give a long, emotional speech. I simply placed the binder on her desk and said, "This is the situation." Unlike the other lawyers, she didn't rush. She opened the binder and began to read. She examined every document, every photo, every bank statement. She was silent for nearly an hour, the only sound in the room, the turning of pages. My mother and I sat, barely breathing. Finally, she closed the binder, folded her hands on top of it, and looked directly at me. "I see," she said, her voice crisp and clear. "Master Sergeant Davis said you were methodical." She then turned to my mother, her expression softening with genuine empathy. "Mrs. Becker, I am so sorry for what you've endured." Then her gaze hardened again as she looked back at me. "Sergeant, let's be clear. This isn't a divorce case. This is a rescue mission, and I'm in." A bond formed between us in that moment, an unspoken trust between two women who had served, who knew what it meant to fight. Sarah spent the next few hours digging deeper into the financial documents. Around midday, she suddenly stopped. She leaned closer to a specific document, her eyes narrowing. "Wait a minute," she said, her voice sharp with excitement. "What is this?" She pointed to a section detailing the ownership of our family home. I explained that my father had always told us the house was in his name. "It was," Sarah said, "until 6 months ago." She turned her laptop around to show us. He transferred the deed to a newly formed LLC, an LLC registered under the name Cassandra Miller. My mother gasped. He was trying to hide his biggest asset, making it look like it wasn't marital property before filing for divorce, Sarah explained. "And to do it, he forged your mother's signature on the transfer documents." She held up a copy of the document next to my mother's real signature on her driver's license. The forgery was clumsy, obvious. "Here it is," Sarah whispered, a grimly triumphant smile on her face. "The smoking gun." Her finger tapped the screen. "This isn't just divorce fraud, Sergeant. This is wire fraud, mail fraud. This is a federal offense. He built his own gallows. Then her eyes lit up as she had one final brilliant realization. She grabbed the divorce settlement papers my father had tried to force on my mother. She flipped to the last page. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," she laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. She pointed to a clause buried in the fine print. It was a standard waiver, stating that my mother relinquished all claims to any assets held by a list of corporate entities. And on that list was the name of Cassandra's shell company. Sarah looked at me, her eyes shining with the thrill of the hunt. He thought he was so clever. In his arrogance, he put the evidence of his crime and the confession right into the papers he wanted her to sign. She leaned back in her chair, a look of pure admiration on her face. "He was so confident," she said, shaking her head. "So confident that he handed us the gun and the ammunition. He was so confident that he had handed us the gun and the ammunition. And today, in this courtroom, I was pulling the trigger." The day of the hearing began just as I had anticipated. My father, Arthur, strode into the Allegheny County courtroom like he owned it. His lawyer, a slick man with too much hair gel, walked beside him, both of them radiating an unearned confidence. My mother, Eleanor, sat beside our lawyer, Sarah Jenkins. She was nervous, her hands clenched in her lap, but she sat straighter than I had ever seen her. My father's arrogance was his greatest weakness. He truly believed he was untouchable. So when the judge urged my mother to sign the settlement one last time, my father couldn't resist a final display of power. He leaned in, whispered his venom, and then he slapped her. That sharp, ugly crack echoed through the room. And as I detailed in the very beginning, his final curse, "You should just die," hung in the air like poison gas. He didn't know it, but he had just walked directly into our trap. His public act of violence had perfectly set the stage. It ripped away any veneer of civility and showed the judge, the lawyers, and everyone in that room exactly who he was: a bully and an abuser. I stood. I placed my green beret on the table, and I delivered the line that started it all. "Your Honor, please refer to the last page." The judge, a man who had clearly seen everything, looked intrigued. He nodded to Sarah. "Ms. Jenkins, please proceed." Sarah stood, calm and collected. "Your Honor, my client, Eleanor Becker, will not be signing this settlement. Furthermore, we have evidence to suggest that this entire proceeding is based on fraudulent premises orchestrated by the plaintiff, Mr. Arthur Becker." My father's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection! This is outrageous." "Sit down, counsel," the judge said, his voice sharp. "I'll allow it. Let's see what they have." That was my cue. Sarah called me to the witness stand. I wasn't there to give an emotional testimony. I was there to present intelligence. I spoke in a clear, measured tone, with no emotion, just facts. "Your Honor," I began, looking directly at the judge. "Exhibit A is a photograph of my mother's arm, taken on November 15, 2020. Please note the extensive bruising." I paused as the photo was displayed on the monitors. The date of this photo corresponds with the date of a 911 call from a neighbor reporting a domestic disturbance at the Becker residence, a copy of which is included as Exhibit B. My father's face began to twitch. His lawyer was whispering furiously in his ear. I continued, my voice never wavering. "Exhibit C is a series of credit card statements from a card held solely in my father's name. You will note charges for a trip for two to the Bahamas in April of this year, coinciding with a time Mr. Becker claimed to be on a solo business trip. You will also note charges for several thousands of dollars worth of jewelry and designer handbags. These items were purchased for a Ms. Cassandra Miller." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my brother, Mark, who was sitting in the back, sink lower in his seat. One by one, I laid out the evidence. The photos with the hidden bruises, the bank statements, the police reports. Each piece of information was a hammer blow, systematically dismantling the facade of the respectable family man my father had built for himself. The room was utterly silent. The smug confidence had evaporated from my father's face, replaced by a pale, sweaty sheen of panic. Then came the final shot. The kill shot. I nodded to Sarah. She stood up, holding a single document. "And finally, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice ringing with authority, We would like to draw your attention to the last page of the very divorce settlement that Mr. Becker has been trying to force my client to sign. She placed the document on the projector. You will find a clause in which Mrs. Becker would waive all rights to a certain LLC, a company named Cassandra's Holdings. Further investigation, as detailed in Exhibit G, shows that Mr. Becker illegally transferred the deed to the family home into this shell company 6 months ago by forging my client's signature. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. My father's lawyer looked like he had been punched in the stomach. He stared at his own client with a look of pure disbelief. The judge took off his glasses, polished them slowly, and put them back on, staring at my father with an expression of utter contempt. The self-assured tyrant was gone. In his place was a cornered animal. The mask of control shattered, revealing the pathetic, raging man underneath. He lost it. He did what he always did when he lost control. He resorted to violence. He lunged, not at my mother, but at me. "You!" he roared, his face purple with rage. "You treacherous little brat! I'll kill you!" He never made it 2 steps. The bailiff, who had been watching him like a hawk, moved with surprising speed, intercepting him and slamming him back into his chair. 2 more officers materialized, and in seconds, they had him in handcuffs. "I'll kill you!" he screamed again, thrashing against their grip, his voice cracking. The judge's gavel came down with a thunderous bang. "That's enough," he boomed. "Mr. Becker, you are under arrest for assault, witness tampering, and felony fraud. Bailiff, get him out of my courtroom." As they hauled him away, still shouting threats and curses, I looked for my brother. Mark was staring at the floor, his face buried in his hands, refusing to look at me, refusing to look at our mother. A perfect portrait of shame. Then I looked at my mom. She was on her feet. For the first time in 30 years, she was standing tall, her back straight, her chin held high. As they led Arthur away, their eyes met one last time across the courtroom. I saw his look of impotent rage, and I saw her look of nothing. The fear was gone. As they led her ex-husband through the doors in handcuffs, Eleanor Becker looked him straight in the eye, and she was no longer afraid. But the moment the courtroom doors swung shut, that ironclad strength seemed to dissolve. My mother sagged against me, her body trembling with the delayed shock of it all. The battle was won, but the aftershocks were just beginning. The drive home was silent. Sarah Jenkins had given us a reassuring nod and told us she would handle the legal fallout. There was no triumphant celebration, no cheering, just the quiet hum of the car engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires on the pavement. My mother stared out the passenger window, her gaze distant. She was looking at the familiar streets of Pittsburgh, at the bridges and the brick buildings, as if seeing them for the first time. It was the landscape of her entire adult life, a life she had just reclaimed, but she seemed to be seeing it through the eyes of a stranger. I understood the silence. This wasn't a moment for celebration. This was a moment for mourning. We were holding a funeral for a 30-year marriage, for the ghost of a family that never really was, for all the years the locusts had eaten. There's a quiet weight to freedom, a heavy price attached to it. Today, we had paid in full. My phone buzzed, startling us both. I glanced at the screen. It was Mark. A knot of cold anger tightened in my stomach. I let it go to voicemail, but he immediately called back. Against my better judgment, I answered, putting it on speaker. "Nola, what did you do?" His voice was a panicked, accusatory squawk. There was no concern for Mom, no relief in his tone, only fear for himself. "Dad's in jail. The whole town is going to be talking about this. You've ruined everything." I calmly pulled the car over, parking along the gray, churning waters of the Monongahela River. I needed to be still for this. "Mark," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, sharp as a razor's edge. "Let me be very clear. I didn't do anything to him that he didn't do to himself, and to Mom, for 30 years. I took a breath, letting the cold fury anchor me. "You were there, Mark. You stood in that room and watched him threaten her. You've been watching your whole life, so the question isn't, what did I do? The question is, why didn't you do anything?" He started to stammer, to make excuses, but I cut him off. "Don't call me again," I said. the words like chips of ice. Don't call this number, not until you have a damn good answer to that question. I hung up and blocked his number. I didn't feel a flicker of regret. A good soldier knows when a position is compromised. My relationship with my brother had been compromised by his cowardice long ago. Today, I was just officially abandoning the post. When we finally pulled into the driveway of the house, her house, it felt different. The air itself seemed lighter. The oppressive, fearful energy that had always clung to the place was gone. It was just a house again. Eleanor stepped out of the car and stood on the lawn for a long moment. Then she walked to the front door, unlocked it, and stepped inside. She took a deep, shuddering breath, filling her lungs with the air of her own home, free of fear for the first time. Her eyes landed on the fireplace mantel, on the gaudy, gold-framed picture of Arthur and Cassandra. She walked over to it with a strange, deliberate calm. She took the photo off the mantel, looked at the smiling faces for a few seconds, and then, with a sharp, satisfying crack, she snapped the frame in two over her knee. She dropped the pieces into the nearby trash can without another glance. It was a declaration. The occupation was over. That evening, we sat in the living room, the quiet feeling comfortable instead of tense. My mother turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "Should I forgive him, Nola?" she asked, her voice soft. I thought about my promise on the porch all those months ago. My job was to make her strong, not to tell her how to use that strength. My role as her protector was evolving. I reached out and took her hand. "Mom, my promise was to keep you safe, not to make your decisions for you," I said gently. "Forgiveness is a complicated thing. You can forgive him for your own peace of mind, so you don't have to carry that anger around. But you never, ever have to let him back into your life. Forgiveness and boundaries are two different things." I gave her hand a squeeze. "What he deserves is irrelevant. What matters now is what you need. Your boundaries, your rules, your life. It's all up to you now." A slow smile spread across her face. It was small, but it was real. In that moment, I realized I had given her back the one thing Arthur had stolen from her, the one thing that mattered more than the house or the money. I had given her back her right to choose, and my mother, Eleanor Becker, began to exercise that right, starting with the smallest, most meaningful rebellions. When I came home on leave a few months later, the change was apparent before I even stepped inside. The timid, faded welcome mat was gone, replaced by a cheerful one that said, "Hello, sunshine." The front door itself was painted a welcoming shade of robin's egg blue. I pushed it open and was met not with the stale, oppressive silence of my childhood, but with the warm, inviting scent of cinnamon and baked apples, and the faint, folksy sound of a James Taylor song drifting from the back of the house. The entire place felt lighter, as if a massive weight had been lifted from its very foundations. The living room walls, once a depressing shade of beige that absorbed all light and joy, were now a vibrant, sunny yellow. Sunlight streamed through the clean windows, illuminating the space, and on every surface, the end tables, the bookshelves, the fireplace mantel, were strange, beautiful objects. Lopsided clay bowls with earthy glazes, wonderfully imperfect mugs with swirling patterns of blue and green, and small whimsical sculptures that looked like birds or abstract flowers. They were all clearly handmade, each one unique, each one a testament to a pair of hands learning to create again. I found her in the kitchen, humming along to the radio, her hands dusted with flour. She was sliding a pan of apple crumble into the oven, a dessert my father had always banned from the house because he found it unsophisticated. She wore a colorful apron over a simple dress, and she moved with a newfound ease, a confidence in her own space that was startling to see. She looked up as I entered, and her face broke into a genuine, unburdened smile that reached all the way to her eyes. She stood taller, the weary stoop in her shoulders completely gone. She laughed, a sound that was clear and bright, and it hit me that I hadn't heard her laugh like that since I was a little girl. "Nola, honey, you're just in time," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I made your favorite." It was true. My father had hated it, but I had always loved it. It was a small detail, but it meant everything. She was no longer catering to his tastes, his moods, his rules. She was finding herself again piece by piece in the color of the paint on her walls, in the notes of a familiar song, and in the simple, defiant act of baking a dessert she loved. Later that afternoon, we sat on the back porch, the one that had once been a place for secret promises made in darkness. Now it was a peaceful sanctuary. We sipped tall glasses of iced tea as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn. The air was filled with the gentle drone of a neighbor's lawnmower and the buzzing of bees around her blooming hydrangeas. The silence between us was easy, filled with a shared understanding that needed no words. After a while, she slid a folded newspaper clipping across the patio table toward me. It was from the local Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, a short human interest piece about the local women's shelter and its new team of volunteers. There was a picture of my mother, sitting on a couch with another woman, her arm around her shoulder, speaking to her with a look of profound, knowing empathy. "You gave me the strength to leave, Nola," she said, her voice quiet but firm as she tapped the picture. It was the hardest thing I ever did. For a while after, I didn't know who I was without him, without the fear that had been my shadow for so long. She looked out at her garden, at the roses she had so carefully tended. You feel like a ghost in your own life. And then one day, you realize you can pick up the pieces. She turned back to me, her eyes clear and full of a purpose I'd never seen before. Now I want to use that strength to help other women find their own way out. I go to the shelter on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I don't tell them what to do. I just listen, and I share my story. I want them to know that they're not alone, and that the first step, the scariest step, is the one that leads to freedom. My promise to her on that same porch echoed in my memory. Don't become the kind of person who made you have to get strong. She hadn't. She had taken 30 years of pain and transformed it into a well of compassion. She had taken her strength and turned it into a gift for others. I remembered reading something by the researcher Brené Brown, a quote that had stuck with me. Vulnerability is not weakness, it's our greatest measure of courage. I'd always thought my courage was forged in the fire of SFIs, measured by my uniform and my ability to endure hardship. But looking at my mom, I realized I was wrong. Her greatest act of courage wasn't in silently enduring 3 decades of abuse. It was having the vulnerability to start a new life at 52, to walk into a community center pottery class full of strangers, to sit with another broken woman and share her deepest wounds to help her heal. That was true strength. Before I left at the end of my leave, I was packing my duffel bag in my old childhood bedroom. The room was mostly the same, but now it felt like a museum of a life that was no longer mine. On my desk, sitting on a small polished piece of cloth, was my old silver medal from the high school science fair, the one I was sure my father had thrown in the trash all those years ago. I found it at the back of a closet when I was cleaning out his old things. My mother said from the doorway. She had polished it. "I thought you should have it." I picked it up. The medal was cool and heavy in my hand. I remembered the burning shame of that day, the feeling of my proudest achievement being dismissed as worthless. Now, holding it, I felt nothing but a quiet sense of peace. It was no longer a symbol of his rejection. It was a marker of the first step on a very long journey. The scar had become part of the armor. As I drove away from that bright yellow house, my car windows down, the fresh air filling my lungs, I thought about the nature of my job. I was a Green Beret. I was trained to be a weapon, to operate in the shadows, to dismantle and disrupt. But the most important operation of my life hadn't involved a single bullet. I'd used the skills the Army gave me: strategy, intelligence gathering, discipline, not to destroy, but to protect, to liberate, to build a lasting peace on the home front. The justice I had fought for wasn't found in the loud, satisfying slam of a gavel or the sight of my father in handcuffs. True justice was in the quiet, ordinary moments that followed. It was the smell of apple crumble in a fearless kitchen. It was the sound of my mother's real laughter carrying on the afternoon breeze. It was the calm in her eyes, the strength in her voice. I had won the most important battle of my life, and I knew No matter what conflicts lay ahead, no matter where in the world my orders sent me, I would always carry that peace with me. A quiet stillness at the very center of the storm. My war at home is over, but I know the world is full of battles, big and small. They aren't always fought on a battlefield with guns and uniforms. Sometimes the fight is for peace in your own heart or for respect in your own home. My strength came from a promise I made in the dark. I'd be honored if you shared one word in the comments that represents your own source of strength. Thank you for listening. Your support on this journey means everything. If these stories of finding justice matter to you, please like and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to share them together.